Hi, my name is May, and I come from a bit of a weird family. My mom, Karen, is a single mom. She's always had to work a couple of jobs to support me, so I spent a lot of time at my grandma's house when I was growing up. Grandma's house was a paradise for a kid. She lived in the suburbs of the town in this cool little cottage that looked like something out of a fairy tale. To get to her house, you had to drive down a dirt road that crisscrossed streams and took you over mythical-looking bridges. My grandma's always been a little eccentric, but as a kid, that was the best thing I could have asked for. We'd play in the woods all day long. She'd talk to the animals as if she was having a full-on conversation with them, and sometimes it kind of seemed like she was. We'd go into her house, and she'd lay crystals out in the window and dry herbs in the rafters. She'd even let me help her make different herbal remedies for sick people in the town. For most of my childhood, everything was perfect. But then, things started getting kind of weird. Once I hit middle school, I still loved doing those things with my grandmother, but the kids in my class had started to hear about the witch that was living in the woods. I always thought the stuff she did was cool, but it seemed like everyone else thought it was nerdy and creepy. To make matters worse, pretty much everyone knew that I was with her every day after school. I started having to laugh off their taunts when they would call my grandmother a hag or evil, but deep down, it really hurt. My grandmother had practically raised me. On top of that, I started to hear weird things in the woods. At least, I thought I did. It was probably some fox or other animals calling out at night, but the sounds made me anxious. My brain scrambled them into voices of monsters, and it made me feel like I was constantly being watched. When I texted Grandma about it one morning, she showed up to pick me from school like always, but she immediately hopped out of the car and started cleansing me with herbs in front of everyone. I was absolutely mortified. All my classmates watched in mocking shock and amazement while I stood there in the cloud as my grandma rushed around me in a frenzy, chanting like a crazy person. I knew the purpose of what she was doing. She likes to use tradition and natural herbs, but I could understand why it made her look like an alien to everyone else. My classmates started taping pentagrams and other creepy stuff on my locker. I'd watch them all giggle as I tore it down. And some people even started talking about the Salem witch trials, saying they thought it was time for a second round. Honestly, I started to get scared and embarrassed. What if my grandma really was a freak? Was she rubbing off on me? Was she actually a witch? I asked my grandma to start picking me up down the street, and at first, I felt really bad about it. But as time progressed, and the taunting didn't stop, I knew I made the right choice by distancing that part of my life from my school life. Once I hit high school, I barely spent time with my grandma anymore. I was old enough to be home by myself, so she didn't need to pick me up, and I didn't need to go over at all. Around that time is where I met Jason. Jason was one of the cool kids. He always had been. And even though kids still remember me as the witch girl, it's almost like enough time had passed that they all started to forget about it. Jason was my chance to live a normal life. I felt like as soon as I became his girlfriend, people would start to like me. I would finally be cool. So when Jason invited me out, I jumped on it. He invited me to ride past curfew in a fancy car with his older friends to go egg a house. And they told me they always do it for fun. Just that was 10 times cooler than anything I had ever done. But when we turned the corner down a familiar dirt road, my heart sank. Everyone started throwing eggs at my grandmother's house, and I felt the disgust and panic set in. Jason nudged me and handed me an egg. Everyone looked at me, waiting for me to react. If I said no, if I didn't do it, would that make me the weird kid all over again? I tossed the egg and watched it splatter against the house. I instantly felt ashamed, but all the cool kids cheered and Jason grabbed my hand. The more I hung out with Jason's group, the more creepy stuff started happening around town. Weird occult symbols started showing up on banners, houses, fences. It seemed like they were everywhere. On top of that, pets were going missing almost every day. Instantly, everyone was whispering about how the witch at the edge of town was the reason, and I didn't tell them it wasn't. Could it really be my grandma? Once the cops got involved, it seemed like every day I was hearing the blame get placed on my grandma. I tried to avoid talking about it as much as possible. I started ignoring her calls. I tried to divert any conversation my classmates had away from her. I was focusing so much on avoiding it that I never could have expected what would happen during the school play. Opening night, I stepped onto the stage in the lead role and was shocked to see my grandma in the audience. Seeing my grandma and my classmates in the same room instantly made my stomach sick. As the play went on, I couldn't help but notice my classmates and even their parents glancing in her direction. When I announced the intermission, everything fell apart. People started yelling at my grandma, asking why she was taking their pets, why she was leaving her weird symbols all over town. They accused her of sacrificing the animals in some ritual. I stood with my mouth open, shocked and wounded. Could my grandma have done all that? The more the crowd yelled, the more it seemed real to me. My grandma stuttered, tears in her eyes, and asked me to tell them she wasn't a witch. All eyes turned to me, and I couldn't do it. In a meek, broken voice, I asked, "Why are you doing this? Why do you have to be such a creep?" In a whirlwind, she ran out of the theater, and I felt my heart sink. Had I really done that to her? But really, she was the only logical explanation. If I hadn't said anything, would everyone have thought I was in on it? The rest of the play was canceled, and I went home. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think. I just felt empty and bitter inside. A few days passed, and my mother told me that Grandma was moving out of town. She thought it would be best for her. I couldn't help but feel the entire thing was my fault. Guilt I felt was so overwhelming. So I decided to go to Jason's late one night and talk it out with him. Maybe we could come up with a plan to stop her, a plan to make the townspeople like her. When I arrived at Jason's place, I saw a light coming from the storage room, which was behind Jason's room, so I thought that he may be there. I went to the window and looked up. I couldn't believe my eyes. The room was filled with many different cages with animals, the same ones that were missing from all around town. Jason noticed my presence and rushed to me, afraid and flustered, trying to explain everything. I didn't want to hear anything from him. When he realized I wasn't going to listen or forgive, he got mean. As I walked away, he swore he would make me the weird kid again. No one would talk to me, and on top of that, he was going to frame my grandma, and I knew he could. I realized I needed to come up with a plan of my own. I turned around and stood my ground. I took out my phone and hit record. I streamed live to everybody, calling Jason out for pinning his actions on an old woman, for betraying my trust. Person after person joined, disgusted by him. But I soon became disgusted with myself. "You put the final nail in your grandma's coffin," Jason yelled at me. Jason was right. I had gotten into the mob mentality. I had demonized my own grandma and pretended I didn't like something that I loved just because other people didn't understand it. I stopped the stream and raced over to my grandma's. When I got there, I found her packing up the final items in her house. I begged her to stay. I told her I loved everything about her. I didn't think she was creepy. I had been trying to fit in with people who weren't worth my time and didn't understand me. I begged for her forgiveness, and she instantly took me in her arms. She let me cry on her shoulder as I apologized, and she completely accepted it. She told me she knew I would be back. When I asked her how, she winked over her shoulder and said, "I saw it in my crystal ball."
Hey guys, my name's Chris. Recently, I had to choose between who goes to prison, my dad or my brother. But I'm 13 years old. How could I even make that choice? We lived a normal life, but when I was 10 years old, my mother died, and our family changed a lot. We mourned her for a very long time. Dad was falling apart and couldn't deal with her death, so he started drinking. And then everything went wrong. He was fired from his job and was barely making any money. And almost all the money he did make, he spent on alcohol. It was terrible when he got drunk. His mood was like a roller coaster. At first he would cry, then scream, and get angry. Then my brother Bruce took on the role of father in our family. He always protected and cared for me. For 3 years we struggled with misfortune, but things got better. We talked a lot with my dad, and he started drinking less. Bruce turned 18 and found a good paying job. We had hope for a normal future, but one night, everything got turned upside down. One day on a weekend, Dad got us a surprise. He had bought tickets to a baseball game. Hooray! We were going to spend the day like a normal family. Dad took us to the stadium and we watched the game. Bruce and I were so happy, but it couldn't have been that good. Dad ended up meeting his friends and left us to watch the game with them. We agreed to meet near the car in 2 hours. But when our game ended, our dad never came. We tried to call him, but he wouldn't answer. We stood by the car for over an hour, and he finally showed up. He could barely stand on his own 2 feet. Apparently, he had gotten drunk with his friends. It really pissed Bruce off and ruined his evening. He took Dad's keys and said he'd drive us himself. We got in the car and drove off. But Dad was aggressive. He kept telling Bruce how to drive, and it was really annoying him. They were fighting and yelling at each other. I didn't want to hear it, so I just closed my eyes and put my hands over my ears. But then it felt like the car jumped, and when I opened my eyes, the last thing I saw was the windshield breaking. When I woke up, I didn't know where I was. I raised my head and saw my brother. He was sitting next to me, covered in scratches and bruises. I was immediately frightened, but he calmed me down. He said that everything was fine. We had been in an accident, but we were lucky because we were almost unharmed. I exhaled. Then I asked where our dad was. Bruce said he was fine. He's just in the other room. But then I remembered their fight and said, "We crashed because he distracted you, right?" This question made my brother think for a moment. Then he said, "Listen, Chris, the police came. They asked about the incident, and I told them that our father was driving, not me. Then my brother said that he might have had a problem with it, but that it would be better for us all if the police thought that my father was driving. Maybe he will be forced into rehab or something." There was something strange about this proposal, but I believed my brother and decided to support him. After this conversation, Bruce was relieved. He said we could go home in the morning and that I needed to sleep. But I couldn't sleep. I was worried I'd have to lie, and I tried to calm myself down. I wanted water, and I couldn't find it in my room, so I went out into the hallway. I have to say, hospital corridors at night look just like they do in horror movies, and you don't expect anything good from them. I kept looking for someone to ask for water, but there was no one around. I walked down the hall to the end, and when I turned the corner, I saw a little girl crying at the entrance to someone's room. I went to her to calm her down, but she wouldn't stop crying. I asked her what happened. She said that her dad was biking home from work and had got hit by a car, and now he's in a coma. I figured out that it was us right away. We were the ones that hit him. What's more, my brother was driving, and he's trying to hide it. This changed everything. It was not just an accident, this was a crime, and Bruce was trying to get our father set up. Yeah, he's a drunk, and my brother was only driving because of him, but he's not guilty. I ran back to the room and woke Bruce up. I started yelling, "Bruce, we didn't just have an accident, you hit a man! Dad is going to jail, do you understand? You have to confess everything!" I started arguing with my brother. He said, "You don't want me to go to jail. I know it's bad, but think about it. Who's going to take care of you? Dad?" Then I said that it didn't matter. A little girl was sitting in the hallway and had no idea whether her father would survive or not. And it was because of Bruce. It was a very difficult choice. One of my loved ones would be in prison, and I had to choose who it would be. And it's not a choice between right and wrong. But I had already made up my mind when I saw that girl. The truth can be unpleasant and painful, but I didn't want to make a deal with my conscience. So I had to find Dad and call the cops and tell them everything. When I went to the entrance, I saw Dad being let out by 2 policemen. I ran up to him and wanted to tell him everything, but my father stopped me. He asked the officers for a few minutes to talk to me, in private. He told me to keep it a secret that Bruce was driving. It turned out that Dad told the police he was driving, and that he hit the cyclist. I tried to stop him, but he made that decision on his own. It looks like he really felt guilty about it. He was taken away, so now it's just my brother and me. A few weeks later, we were allowed to see our dad. He apologized to us for the past 3 years. He said he lied to the police because it would be better for both of us, and Bruce can really take care of me. Later, we found out that the cyclist had